He turned her into a joke, a black waitress invited to the most lavish gala in the city, just to be humiliated. He expected laughter, whispers, a spectacle. But when the doors opened, no one made a sound. She walked in wearing a $2 million gown, a piece no one there could buy, no matter how rich they were. The man who laughed at her froze. To understand how we got here, we have to go back. The Le Bernardin rooftop pulsed with soft golden light, the kind designed to make diamonds catch fire on the collarbones of women who had never cooked a meal in their lives. Yena Okonkwo moved between the tables like a shadow stitched into the walls. 32 years old, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her black uniform pressed sharp enough to cut. She had served here for 3 years. In 3 years, she had memorized the face of every regular, and not one of them had learned hers. A man at table 12 was struggling with the sleeve of his Tom Ford jacket as he stood to leave. Yena stepped forward, helped him into it, and her fingers lingered for the briefest second over a loose stitch near the cuff. Without thinking, she pressed the thread down, smoothing the seam flat against the lining. The man did not notice. He was already laughing at something his date had said. Across the room, a French businessman was explaining something to his American host, mangling the phrase haute couture into something closer to a sneeze. Yena poured his wine, and in a voice so quiet only he could hear, corrected him, the syllables perfect, unhurried landing like they belonged to her. The Frenchman looked up startled. She was already walking away. At a corner table, a silver-haired man in a navy suit watched her over the rim of his Bordeaux. He had been coming to this restaurant for 2 years. He had ignored the woman who cleared his plates for most of that time. The last few months had been different. He had begun quietly with people he paid not to ask questions to confirm what he had begun to suspect. Tonight, listening to her correct a Parisian businessman in flawless French, he had finished confirming it. His name was Richard Ashworth III, and Yena Okonkwo was no longer a puzzle. She was a decision he had already made. The staff break room smelled like burnt espresso and bleach. Yena sat on an overturned milk crate peeling the foil off a granola bar when Elena Vasquez dropped onto the bench beside her with a sketchbook pressed to her chest. "I finished it," Elena said. She was 28, loud in ways Yena was not, with ink on her fingers and flour on her shoes, from her second job at a bakery on 125th Street. She flipped the sketchbook open and laid it across Yena's lap. "Tell me the truth, and I mean the real truth, not the nice truth." Yena studied the drawing, a gown midnight blue structured at the shoulders, something raw and brave about the waistline. Elena was studying design at Parsons on a scholarship that covered half of what it needed to. The other half she served to strangers who tipped her in loose change. "The shoulders are fighting the hips," Yena said quietly. "Pick one. Either the structure lives up here or it lives down there, not both." Elena stared at her. "How do you always know that?" "I used to watch a lot of runway shows," Yena answered, handing the sketchbook back. "You know who else would have said that, M. Okon? I swear to God." Elena's voice dropped into something reverent. "Did you ever see the Ashes and Silk collection, the way those sleeves moved? I actually cried." She leaned back against the wall, sketchbook hugged to her chest again. "Do you think she's ever coming back?" Yena folded the foil wrapper around the uneaten half of her granola bar. "Some people disappear because they have to," she said. "That's a sad thing to say." "It's a true thing to say." Elena watched her for a long moment as though she were about to ask something else. Then the kitchen bell rang, and the question, whatever it was, dissolved into the noise of the next service. 3 nights later, Richard came back. This time, he was not alone. He arrived with 5 others, all dressed in the practiced ease of people who only socialized with their own kind. Yena recognized 2 of them from magazines she had stopped reading years ago. The woman seated to Richard's right, blonde mid-40s, a low laugh that carried across the dining room like a knife dragged along glass, was the most familiar of them all. Her name was Caroline Whitmore. Yena felt the hair on the back of her neck lift the moment she heard the laugh. She had heard that laugh before, not in person. On a phone screen 11 minutes before, her sister had stopped recording anything ever again. Yena kept her hand steady. She poured water. She recited the specials. She did not look at Caroline twice. But Richard noticed everything. He noticed the way Yena's spine had drawn a quarter-inch straighter when Caroline laughed. He noticed the way her eyes did not return to that side of the table afterward. He filed it away the way other men filed stock tickers. Toward the end of the meal, he beckoned her over with 2 fingers. Miss Richard said loud enough that the rest of the table turned to listen. "What is your name?" "Yena," she answered. "Yena what?" "Just Yena, sir." He smiled at this, the way a man smiles when he is certain the door is locked from his side. "Yena, the Ashworth Foundation is hosting our annual gala on Saturday at the Pierre. I would like you to come." The table fell into the kind of silence reserved for jokes that had not landed yet. Caroline reached for her wine glass with a slowness that was theatrical. "Sir, I am working on Saturday. I will speak to your manager. He is a friend." Richard's eyes did not move from her face. "Consider it a night off. I'm extending you a personal invitation. I'd like you to see how the other half lives." A man across from him snorted into his napkin. Caroline's smile widened, slow and amused. "Richard," Caroline said, "how generous of you." "I think it's important," Richard continued, "for people in your position to see what's possible. I'd hate for someone with your presence to spend her whole life pouring water for it." Yena understood every layer of the moment. She understood the joke. She understood that the table understood the joke. She understood that her humiliation was the entertainment they had ordered with the wine. She said, "What time, sir?" Caroline's smile faltered for half a beat, not because Yena had agreed, but because Yena had not flinched. Richard felt the same shift and recovered faster than the rest of the table. 7 o'clock. Black tie. We will send a car. That will not be necessary. It was not a question. Yena nodded once the way she nodded at customers who refused the dessert menu and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, Caroline laughed again. The same laugh from the video. Yena felt her hand tighten around the empty water pitcher until the metal warmed. The apartment in Harlem had 2 rooms and 1 window that faced an air shaft. Yena took the train home in silence, a paperback open in her lap that she did not read. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, locked the door behind her, set her keys in the dish her mother had sent from Lagos, and did not turn on the overhead light. She walked instead to the closet at the back of the bedroom and slid the door open. Inside, on a dressmaker's form, stood the only thing in the apartment that mattered. The gown was almost finished. 5 years of nights, 5 years of her hands moving in the dark, while the city slept 5 years of black silk and 10,000 obsidian beads, set one at a time by a needle she had not let any other person touch. The single red thread at the collar, the signature she had buried with everything else, was the last stitch left to set. She had built it for her sister. She had built it as a letter to a person who could not read anymore. She had set aside this coming Saturday years ago. It was the 5th anniversary of the morning she had found her sister, and she had planned to spend it the way she had spent every anniversary since, alone on a slow train upstate, with the gown folded carefully across her arms. The cemetery in Beacon was supposed to be the only room that ever saw it. Now, on that same Saturday at 7 o'clock, Richard Ashworth wanted her at the Pierre. The apartment around her was small, not because she could not afford better. The royalties from the old collections still arrived each quarter in envelopes she opened only long enough to sign. Most of what came in went quietly back into the gown, the silk woven in Lagos, the obsidian beads ordered 1 box at a time over 5 winters. She had not in 5 years kept anything for herself. Yena knelt on the carpet and pulled a shoebox from beneath the form. Inside were photographs. Ada at 15 laughing at the kitchen table. Ada at 20 on the runway in Milan, the only show she had ever walked. Ada at 22, the last birthday picture, her smile already a little tired around the edges in a way Yana had not understood until much later. Her phone vibrated on the floor beside her. She picked it up without looking. It was her mother. It was always her mother on Tuesday nights. "Hello, Mama." The voice on the other end was warm and far away, as it had been every Tuesday for the past 5 years. They spoke about the weather in Lagos. They spoke about a cousin's wedding. Then in the quiet that always came at the end of these calls, her mother asked the question she always asked, and that Yana always declined to answer. "How are you, Yana? The real answer." Yana looked at the gown across the room. "A man invited me somewhere I should not go, Mama, to laugh at me, on Saturday." Her mother understood without being told what Saturday meant. She did not speak for a long while. When she did, she said it in Igbo, the language they only used for the things that hurt. "You do not owe this world your silence. And you do not owe your sister your absence from rooms she would have loved." Yana closed her eyes. "Sleep, my daughter," her mother said. "Tomorrow you will know." She did not sleep. She sat on the floor in front of the gown until the air shaft outside began to gray with dawn. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, she understood something she had been refusing to understand for 5 years. She had told herself all this time that staying invisible was a form of mourning, that serving water in silence was the only honorable response to the world that had killed her sister, that if she ever stepped back into a room full of people like Caroline Whitmore, she would be betraying Ada's memory by walking through a door Ada could no longer walk through. But sitting there with her mother's voice still in her ear, she finally heard what she had refused to hear for 5 years. Her silence had not protected Ada. It had only protected the women who had laughed at her. Yana stood up. She crossed the room and lifted the spool of red silk thread from the small work box on the dresser. She threaded the needle by the gray light from the window. Then she sat down at the form carefully and began the final stitch, the single red line at the inside of the collar, the mark that anyone in the industry who mattered would recognize at a glance. Her hands did not shake. They had not done this work in 5 years, and they did not shake. Outside, somewhere on the avenue, a delivery truck reversed and a dog began to bark, and a city she had been hiding inside continued to wake up without her. She finished the stitch as the sun came up. She tied off the thread, snipped the end, and stepped back to look at what she had made. It was not a dress for revenge. She had no use for revenge. It was a dress that would walk into a room Ada had not survived and refuse this time to lower its eyes. She whispered her sister's name once into the empty apartment. Then Yana Okonkwo went to make coffee and decide what she was going to wear underneath. Saturday arrived the way Saturdays do, indifferent to everyone counting on them. In a penthouse on 5th Avenue, Caroline Whitmore arranged a row of champagne flutes on a marble counter and reviewed for the 3rd time the seating chart Richard had marked up in red pen. The photographer they had hired, a freelancer who normally shot Fashion Week, sat near the window, pretending not to listen. "You want her at table 41, Caroline said. "Not the head, not the back, 41. 41 is in the sight line of 3 different camera angles," Richard answered. He stood by the window, knotting a black bow tie without looking in any mirror. "Caroline, I want a clean shot of the moment she picks up the wrong fork. There are 6 forks at every place setting tonight." "That is precisely the point." The photographer cleared his throat. "And what exactly am I capturing, sir?" Richard finished the knot. A teaching moment. In the doorway behind them, James Ashworth heard everything. He had come downstairs to ask his father about a board meeting and was now standing very still in the hallway with his hand on the doorframe. He was 26 years old, and he had spent most of those years deciding every time he opened his mouth in his father's house whether what he had to say was worth what it would cost him. He did not open his mouth. He turned around and went back upstairs. Across the city, in a small apartment in Harlem, Yana was not preparing the way Caroline imagined a woman like her would prepare. She had not bought new shoes. She had not booked a salon. She washed her hair at the kitchen sink with the same shampoo she had used for 10 years, twisted it into a low knot at the nape of her neck, and set out 2 earrings on the dresser, small gold studs that had belonged to her grandmother. They were the only jewelry the gown would tolerate. She lifted the gown from its form the way a mother lifts a sleeping child. She did not hurry. She had until 7 o'clock, and she had been ready for 5 years. The Pierre was lit from within, like something on fire. Black cars idled along Fifth Avenue in a line that bent 2 blocks down, and the women stepping out of them did so with the practiced grace of people who had been photographed since childhood. Inside the ballroom, 300 guests moved through the cocktail hour with the particular sound. Rich rooms make low laughter the clink of crystal, the soft thunder of careful conversation. Richard had positioned himself near the entrance. So had Caroline. So had the photographer who had been told to look casual. 7 o'clock came, then 7:15. Caroline checked her watch twice and tilted her head toward Richard with a smile that said, "She is not coming." Richard did not smile back. At 7:17, the doorman opened the door for one more guest and the cocktail hour stopped. It did not stop the way a room goes silent for a celebrity. Celebrities arrived all the time. It stopped the way a room goes silent when something enters that no one has the language for yet. Yena stood in the doorway alone. The gown caught the light differently from anything else in the room. Black silk, but not still, the obsidian beads worked with the air, so that even her smallest breath made the whole skirt move like dark water under a moon. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was bare. She wore no jewelry except the 2 small gold studs. She was very simply the most beautiful person any of them had ever seen, and that was the easiest part of what she was. Richard exhaled slowly, set down his glass, and recovered. Rented, he told himself. Borrowed from someone foolish. He had seen this trick before women who dressed beyond their means for one night, who could be politely returned to their lives by Monday morning. He felt the ground steady itself under him. He began to walk toward her, smiling the smile he used at press conferences. He did not reach her. A man near the bar had stopped speaking mid-sentence. He was a senior editor at one of the 3 magazines that mattered, and he was staring at the back of Yena's collar as she turned to thank the doorman. His wife followed his gaze. So did the woman next to his wife, who held a flute of champagne suspended in the air like a thought she had forgotten to finish. "That cannot be," the editor said quietly. "That cannot be what I think it is." His wife asked what he meant. He did not answer. He pulled out his phone, framed a careful picture of the back of Yena's neck, and sent it to 2 people in Paris. The gown's collar carried on the inside seam where most people would never look a single red stitch. It was not decorative. It was not part of the design. It was a signature, and there were perhaps 40 people alive who would recognize it on sight, and 7 of them were in the room. The editor's phone buzzed within 90 seconds. He read the reply, read it again, and sat down slowly on a chair he had not realized was behind him. The whisper started near the bar and traveled on the kind of currents only that particular room had. It did not move loudly. It moved the way money moves quietly between the right ears with absolute precision. The collar. Look at the collar. Tell me I am not seeing a red stitch on that collar. Across the room, Richard was still walking toward Yena, but more slowly now, because the room had begun almost imperceptibly to rearrange itself around her. People were turning. Not staring, turning. The way iron filings turn when a magnet is brought into the room. He could not yet say what was wrong. He only knew that something he had set in motion was no longer moving in the direction he had set it. Caroline appeared at his elbow. Her smile had thinned. "Richard," she said, "who is that woman?" The crowd was beginning to part without anyone telling it to part. A woman was crossing the ballroom from the far end. Silver hair cut short and sharp, a black suit cut so well it made every other garment in the room apologize for itself. She had been the editor-in-chief of Vogue Paris for 19 years before she retired, and she had not in those 19 years ever bowed her head to anyone. Her name was Isabelle Dupont, and the people who knew who she was were already stepping aside. Richard knew who she was. She walked past Richard without looking at him. She walked past Caroline without looking at her. She walked the length of the ballroom in the particular unhurried way of women who had nothing left to prove to anyone, and she stopped 3 feet in front of Yana. The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the staff had stopped moving. Isabelle studied Yana's face for a long moment, the way one studies a painting one has not seen in a very long time. Then, in front of 300 of the most powerful people in American fashion society and finance, she lowered her head in a small, precise bow. She spoke in French and her voice carried. "Welcome back, Miss Ocon. I have waited 5 years." There was a sound in the room that was not quite a sound. A collective intake of breath, the soft mechanical click of phones being lifted. The small noise 300 people make when they realize simultaneously that a story they thought was finished was not actually finished. Yana inclined her head in return. She answered Isabelle in French as well, quietly, only one sentence, and the older woman's eyes filled with something that was not tears, but was very close to them. Then Isabelle turned finally and looked at Richard. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She held his gaze for the length of time it took for him to understand that she had known all along exactly whose house this was, and that he had spent 5 years pretending he ran a kingdom that had never been his. Then she walked past him a second time, and the room began slowly to remember how to move. It happened the way avalanches happen, slowly at first, and then all at once. The CEO of an Italian luxury house who had flown in from Milan that morning set down his glass and crossed the room. A senior buyer from a flagship department store followed him. A documentary filmmaker who had spent 2 years trying to find M. Ocon and had given up was already crying quietly into a cocktail napkin near the chocolate fountain. Within 10 minutes, there was a soft, careful queue of people waiting for an audience with the woman in the black gown, and not one of them was the host of the gala. Richard stood near the bar. For the first time in 20 years in a room he was paying for, no one was looking at him. He understood in a clean and clinical way what had happened. He had spent his entire career counting the weight of the people in any given room, knowing instinctively whose attention was worth what. He could feel his own weight redistributing now in real time. He was becoming light. He was becoming a man. People were politely stepping around in order to reach someone else. Caroline tried to recover. She was Richard remembered with a strange, distant clarity, very good at recovering. She fixed her smile, lifted her chin, and walked across the polished floor toward Yana, as though she were greeting an old friend at a charity luncheon. "Miss Ocon," Caroline said warmly, "it is such an honor." Yana turned and looked at her. The look was not theatrical. It was not cruel. It was the look of a woman who had spent 5 years memorizing a face from a video and was now matching it finally to the person standing in front of her. "I remember you," Yana said. Her voice was quiet enough that Caroline had to lean in to hear it. "You were at the after-party, the one in the meatpacking district, 5 years ago in October." Caroline's smile did not move. Her eyes did. My sister, Yana continued, remembered you too, until the very end. She remembered every word. Caroline opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Yana did not wait for anything to come out. She turned back to the line of people waiting to speak to her, and Caroline was left standing alone in the middle of the floor with her champagne flute trembling in her hand. Richard understood what he had to do. A man in his position did not survive moments like this by retreating from them. He survived by stepping into them and rewriting them in real time. He had done it through 3 recessions, 2 divorces, and 1 federal investigation. He squared his shoulders, set his glass on the tray of a passing server, and crossed the floor. He arrived at Yana's side with the warmest, easiest smile he had ever produced. "Miss Ocon," he said loud enough to carry. "You did not give me the satisfaction of preparing a proper introduction. I should have known the moment I saw you in the restaurant. Forgive me. This was, I confess, my way of inviting you back. He let the lie settle for half a second, judging the room. The room was watching. The room had not yet decided what it had just heard. He pressed forward. I have wanted for 5 years to bring you back to where you belong. Tonight is in its way my apology. And my welcome. Yena looked at him for a long while. Her face did not move. Then calmly she reached into the small black clutch she had been carrying at her side and produced a single folded sheet of paper. The paper was old. The fold lines were soft from being opened and closed many times. Mr. Ashworth. She said, I still have the letter you sent to Mems Yokon 5 years ago. The one your assistant delivered to my studio in person with a contract and a number with 7 zeros. She held up the folded paper without unfolding it. Would you like me to read it aloud? Richard's smile did not falter because his smile had never in 20 years faltered in public. But the color left his face the way water leaves a glass with a hairline crack invisibly and then all at once. He understood in that moment that there was no version of the next 60 seconds in which he won. If he refused, he had refused in front of 300 witnesses. If he agreed, the letter would be read into the air of his own ballroom. The room had gone quiet again. Even the music seemed to have lowered itself. That will not be necessary, Richard said. I thought not, Yena answered, and slipped the letter back into her clutch. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. The terrace was the only place in the Pierre where the city was louder than the Gala. Yena had stepped out for air. Below her, Fifth Avenue ran like a river of slow red and white lights, and somewhere down the block a taxi was leaning on its horn at no one in particular. She held the railing with both hands and breathed deliberately the way her mother had taught her to breathe many years ago. The terrace door opened behind her. She did not turn around. Miss Okon, a young man's voice said, I am very sorry to disturb you. She knew who he was without looking. He had Richard's height and none of his ease. My name is James Ashworth, he said. I am his son. I wanted to apologize for all of it, for tonight, for... His voice caught somewhere it had not expected to catch. For your sister. I know about your sister. I tried to tell my father. 5 years ago, I had heard things. I tried. Yena turned then and looked at him. He was a tall, thin young man holding a glass of water he had clearly forgotten he was holding. He could not quite meet her eyes. How old were you, James, 5 years ago? She asked. 21. Old enough to know what you knew. Yes. And tonight. She said, you knew what your father intended to do to me, before I walked through the door. He did not answer. The answer was already on his face. Why did you not warn me, James? He looked down at the glass in his hand. I did not know how. Yena nodded slowly. The city below them was indifferent to all of this, which was in its way a comfort. Silence is its own kind of permission, she said finally. I know that better than most people in this room. I gave it for 5 years. I am not giving it tonight. She turned back to the railing. After a long moment, she heard James set the glass down on a small wrought iron table and walk back inside. She stayed on the terrace until the wind cooled the heat behind her eyes. Richard found her there. He did not approach the railing. He stopped near the door, gave the terrace a single, careful glance to confirm they were alone, and waited until Yena turned around on her own. Miss Okon, I wonder if you would join me briefly in the study. There is something I would prefer to say to you in private. Yena considered him for a long time. Then she walked past him without speaking, and he followed her down a hallway lined with portraits of his father and grandfather to a small oak-paneled room he used for private conversations during events. He closed the door behind them. For a moment, he did not speak. He stood with his back to her, looking at the bookshelves as though searching the spines for the right opening line. Then he turned, and the smile he had worn on the floor was gone, and what was underneath was something Yena had not expected to see. It was tiredness. It was a man who had run out of moves and knew it. "I knew who you were," Richard said quietly. "Not from the first night. I lied about that on the floor. But for the past several months, yes. My people identified you 8 months ago. A photograph from the Lagos airport. Facial recognition matched you to a press still from the Ashes and Silk show. I have known where you live, where you work, and what train you take for most of this year." Yena did not move. "I did not invite you here only to humiliate you, Miss Okan. Although I did." He turned the signet ring on his smallest finger, a habit she suspected he had never noticed in himself. "I wanted you to come back, to the industry, to the work. And I wanted when you came back to be the man holding the door. Exclusive contract, magazine of record, investment, distribution, all of it. You wanted to own me," Yena said. "I wanted to invest in you. Those are not the same word in any language I speak." He acknowledged that with a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The letter you sent me 5 years ago," he said, "I have kept in a safe in my office. I have read it more times than I will admit to you. I told myself you did not understand the offer. I told myself you were emotional. I told myself many things." He looked at her directly now. "I never told myself the simplest thing, which was that you saw me clearly and decided no." Yena considered him for a long moment. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, "you were not wrong tonight because you did not know who I was." He waited. "You were wrong because you thought I was nothing. Even when I was nothing, you would recognize, even as a woman pouring your wine. My sister was nothing you would recognize either. Elena Vasquez, the girl I work with, is nothing you would recognize. And we are still people. The error was never in your information, Mr. Ashworth. The error was in what you decided people were worth before you bothered to find out." The room was very quiet. Richard sat down slowly in the leather chair by the desk. He did not invite her to sit. He had forgotten to. He looked at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. "I do not know," he said finally, "what to do with that." "I know," Yena answered. "That is the first honest thing you have said to me." She did not wait for a reply. She opened the door, stepped back into the hallway, and walked in a gown her sister had never lived to see, the long way back through the ballroom, past Caroline, past Isabel, past James, and out into the night. By 6 in the morning, the story had its own gravitational field. 3 of the 4 major papers led with it. 2 of the international ones had it on their front pages in different languages. The phrase that ran across most of the headlines was not the one Richard had prepared for. It was not humiliation, and it was not scandal. It was simply M. Okan returns, and underneath in smaller print, the photograph that the senior editor had taken of the back of a black silk collar, the single red stitch catching the light like a small wound that had decided to become a signature. Richard read all of them in his study before the housekeeper arrived. He did not have coffee. He did not turn on the lights. He sat in the same leather chair he had sat in the night before, and he watched the city come awake outside his window, and he did not move. By 8, his phone had begun to behave like a phone owned by a different man. 2 of his largest advertisers at Crown Magazine, the flagship publication of Ashworth Media, the family company that owned the foundation, the Gala, and most of the rooms he stood in, were withdrawing for the quarter. A third had requested a call. The publicist his foundation kept on retainer had texted 3 times in increasingly careful sentences asking for guidance. The board chair of his own company had left a voicemail that began with "Richard, we need to talk," and did not improve from there. Caroline Whitmore was being asked by a journalist who had been quietly working the story for 2 years to comment on a video from an after-party in October of 2020. James, his information lined up cleanly, and provided to the right reporter the night before, had handed her over without ever needing to raise his voice. Richard understood by the time the sun cleared the building across the avenue that he had lost more than a news cycle. He had lost the architecture his life sat on. He walked finally to the safe behind the painting in the wall. He turned the dial without thinking. He took out the letter he had kept there for 5 years, the one he had read so many times the creases had gone soft, and he sat back down in the leather chair and read it one more time. He had read it all those years looking for the loophole, for the sentence that meant the door was not actually closed. This morning, for the first time, he read it the way it had been written. The letter said what it had always said. I do not sell my work to people who do not understand it. He had taken that every other time as a negotiation tactic. This morning, in the gray light with 300 witnesses freshly behind him, he read it as the simplest sentence in the English language. It was not a tactic. It had never been a tactic. She had looked at him through her work and decided accurately who he was. He folded the letter, set it on the desk, and put his face in his hands. He did not get to be forgiven on a clean schedule. Within the week, the board moved to restructure his role at Crown magazine. He retained the title and lost most of what the title had done. By the end of the month, 2 long-standing business partners had quietly let it be known that their next dinners would not include him. By the second month, James had moved out of the apartment on 5th Avenue and into a small place near the river, and had told his father, with a calm Richard had never managed himself, that he would not be inheriting Ashworth Media in any form he recognized. I am not punishing you, James said the last morning he came by to collect his books. I am only declining to continue what you built. You can decide whether those are the same thing. Richard did not argue. He was not any more a man who argued at breakfast tables. He began that winter to write, not press releases, not statements through lawyers. He bought a notebook at a stationery shop in the West Village he had walked past for 30 years and never entered, and he sat down each morning in his study and wrote slowly by hand the things he had spent his life paying other people not to ask him about. His father's voice, the rooms he had built to keep that voice quiet, the faces of the people he had stepped over to do it, the particular sound of Caroline Whitmore's laugh and the fact that he had heard it for many years and never once asked himself what it was laughing at. He did not write a hero. He did not have material for one. He wrote instead the most careful and honest pages he had ever produced, and he did not yet know what he would do with them. Beginning for a man like Richard Ashworth III was not a sunrise. It was the slow, unglamorous work of staying in a chair he did not enjoy, in a life that had finally become smaller than his name. Jena did not give a single interview. 3 days after the gala, on a cold, gray morning in late October, she rode a train upstate to the small cemetery outside Beacon, where her sister was buried. She did not bring a bouquet. She had not in 5 years been able to choose flowers without weeping in the shop, and so she had stopped trying. She brought the gown. She changed in the small caretaker's restroom near the entrance, folded her street clothes into a paper bag, and walked the long stone path to her sister's stone with the obsidian beads moving against her legs in a wind off the river. The cemetery was empty. The sky was the color of old silver. She stopped at the foot of the grave and stood there for a long time without saying anything. When she spoke in Igbo. She told her sister about the room. She told her about Caroline's face. She told her about the woman from Paris who had bowed her head, and about the boy on the terrace who had not warned her, and about the man in the study who had finally said the first honest sentence of their acquaintance. She told her about the red stitch. Then she reached up to the inside of the collar, and with the small pair of scissors she had brought in her clutch, she cut the single red thread free. She knelt down, set the thread carefully on the top of the headstone, and weighed it down with a small white stone she had picked up on the path. "This was always yours," she said in English finally. "I only carried it for you." She walked back up the path in the gown changed in the caretaker's restroom, folded the gown into the paper bag with as much care as she had once used to build it, and rode the train back to the city. She did not wear the gown again. She did not need to. 3 months later, on a side street in the Bronx, she signed the lease on a building that had been a textile warehouse in the 1950s and a furniture showroom for 20 years after that. The space was 4 floors exposed brick and far too large for a sensible woman to take on by herself. She did not take it on by herself. Isabelle Dupont came over from Paris for 2 weeks and stayed for 4 months. She arrived with her own measuring tapes and 2 assistants and an opinion about every doorway. Elena Vasquez, who had cried in the staff break room on the morning the news broke and had not stopped apologizing for crying for an entire afternoon, was the first student admitted. There were 8 others by spring, all of them young, all of them the kind of designer the rooms Yana had walked away from did not by default make space for. Yana called the building Ada House. It was not a fashion house. It was not a brand. It was a school, and it was free, and the entrance requirements were the kind of requirements rooms like the one at the Pierre had never asked of anyone. Show your work. Tell the truth. Do not waste the time of the people sitting next to you. She took her name back on the small brass plate by the door. Yana Okonkwo, director, not M. Okon. The bylined name was in the end the only name she had ever wanted. She had only needed 5 years and 1 black dress to find her way back to it. She designed again in the small studio on the top floor. She did not sell. She gave her work to the students to dismantle, study, and rebuild in their own hands. Some of them in time would have rooms of their own. Some of them would have voices the industry had never heard before. Yana watched them in the mornings with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had finally understood what her work had been for. A year passed. It was a Saturday in the fall, and Yana had stepped into a small second-hand bookstore on a corner in Brooklyn she sometimes walked to on the weekends. The shop was narrow and warm and smelled like old paper, and she liked it because no one in it ever recognized her, and because the owner kept a tabby cat who slept on the philosophy shelf with one paw extended. She was looking for a book on West African textiles for a student. She found it on the second shelf from the bottom near the back wall, and as she straightened up with the book in her hand, she found herself standing 2 feet away from Richard Ashworth III. He was holding a thin volume on the history of Yoruba dyeing techniques. He was older than she remembered. The expensive ease was gone. He wore a gray sweater and a wool coat and a pair of glasses she had never seen on him. He looked in a way that surprised her, like a man who had been doing his own grocery shopping for a year. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I read your letter again," Richard said finally, "after that night, the one I had been keeping. I imagined you might. You were right. I did not understand them. Any of it. The work, the collection, you. I was reading it for 1 year looking for the place where I could win the argument. And there was no argument. There was only me not understanding." Yana nodded once slowly. She had carried this small, complicated piece of him with her in the back of her mind for a year, and she discovered now that she did not need to carry it anymore. "You are trying to understand now," she said. "I am. That is the only thing that ever mattered, Mr. Ashworth." He nodded. He did not extend his hand. He had learned somewhere in the past 12 months not to extend his hand to people who had not asked for it. She tucked the textile book under her arm. "Take care of yourself," she said. And she meant it in the small, surprised way one means such things to a person one has stopped needing to defeat. She walked past him to the register, paid for the book in cash, and stepped out into the afternoon. The street was full of an ordinary Saturday children's shopping bags, a man selling roasted nuts on the corner. The sun was bright. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at a leaf. Yana Okonkwo walked into the rest of her life carrying a book about cloth, and she did not look back because there was nothing left anymore to look back at. This story does not end the way you walked into it expecting it to end. Yana did not return to that ballroom to win. She did not return to ruin Richard Ashworth, although that happened. She did not return to expose Caroline Whitmore, although that happened too. She returned because she had spent 5 years confusing silence with grief, and one cold morning in front of a dressmaker's form in Harlem, she finally understood the difference. Real power in the end was never the power to make someone smaller. It was the power to refuse to make yourself smaller. And the people who had spent their lives in beautiful rooms perfecting the first kind had no defense, none at all, against a woman who had finally chosen the second. So here is the question worth carrying out of this story. Where in your own life have you been pouring water for a room that was never going to look at you? And what would change tomorrow if you simply stopped? If you have an answer, even half of one, leave it down in the comments. The stories shared there are very often the reason the next one gets written. Read them when you have a moment. You are not the only one in that room. If this story stayed with you tonight, a quiet thumbs up helps it find someone else who might need it. And if you would like more stories like this, slow ones, honest ones about people who walk back into rooms on their own terms, go ahead and subscribe so the next one finds you when you need it. Take care of yourselves out there. The next time someone in a chandeliered room decides you are nothing, remember Yena. Remember the red thread. And remember that the most powerful thing anyone can ever wear into a room is themselves, fully, finally, and without apology.